Hello PWL fans and welcome to the first draft retrospective video. Today we are going to go over the 5 players picked in the first round of the PWL draft and see how they performed comparative to their draft spot during the season. How this will work is we'll take a look at every game the player in question played in and how they performed over the course of the season. We'll also take a look at their stats, awards, and accolades, as well as some background on the player in general. By the end of the analysis, we'll judge the player as one of 3 categories. Steal, where the player performed much better than their draft position would have you assume. Good pick, where the player performed about as much as you would hope given their pick. And reach, where the player did not meet the expectations of their draft slot. I would like to take this moment to clarify that a player being a reach does not mean that they're a bad player, only that they were selected too high in the draft. Given that we'll be going over the first round, this is likely where you'll see the most amount of draft reaches. Before we begin, I'd like to talk about player archetypes. When we analyze each player, they'll receive an archetype and a sub-archetype that indicates their playstyle, an easy way to define what kind of player they are. So I'd like to take this moment to explain each archetype and sub-archetype. Firstly, the 3 main divisions. Firstly, power. These are players who rely more on athleticism and strength to score eliminations and are generally more aggressive in their playstyle. The second archetype is technique. These are players who are a bit more refined and instead of pure talent use a little more skill and control in scoring points. The third archetype is balanced, where their playstyle meets somewhere in between. Now, each archetype has 3 sub-archetypes. Power's first is serve specialist. One of the more exciting moments of any given round is the serve, where serve specialists shine. They take full advantage of their invulnerability when receiving the serve to unleash some truly devastating receives. The next sub-archetype of power is full throttle. These are players who care little for the short side of the table and would much rather just rifle the ball back and forth across the long end, relying on true power. The final sub-archetype of power is spiker. Pretty much everyone in the league can spike a ball that gives them the opportunity to, but what sets spikers apart is their special ability to create those very opportunities themselves, instead of having to wait for one to show itself, where they can then hit an almost unreceivable ball. Moving on to technique, its first sub-archetype is survivalist. These players care little about knocking other players out and are masters of attrition. Their biggest strength is staying in the game as long as possible. The next sub-archetype of technique is corner threat. The opposite of full throttle, corner threats take the game to the short side of the table as soon as possible, preferring the ring around the rosy type experience as opposed to a tennis-like slugfest. Technique's last archetype is manipulator. These are true talents with the ball, using various different swinging motions and utilizing backspin, forward spin, curveballs, and more in order to throw off their opponents. Finally, the balanced archetype. Its first sub-archetype is all-rounders. These players are jack-of-all-trades, master of none, who really fit into every category just as much as they don't, or are entirely unique in their playstyle. The second balanced archetype is adapter. Adapters are similar to survivalists, but while survivalists are all about receiving the ball, adapters adapt to the playstyles of others in order to gain as much of an advantage as possible. Finally, the last sub-archetype of balanced is court general. While adapters adapt to other playing styles, court generals take control of the game, forcing others to adapt to theirs. With these out of the way, let's finally get to the analysis of the players. Round 1, Pick 1. Matthew Conrad. With the first overall pick of the league's 35-man draft, the then Bethany Herons, now Eagles, selected Matthew Conrad. Conrad showed a balanced playstyle, opting for an adapter role as he mostly focused on surviving to the next round, though he did have some pretty iconic moments. Matthew Conrad's best game came in his first one, Week 1, Game 2, when he scored 12 points on 2 eliminations and 1 regicide. From that point forward, Conrad never broke double-digit scores ever again, getting closest in Week 5 when he scored 8 points. Conrad tied the record for the least points scored in any game in Week 6 with 2, and his stats were nothing special as he finished with the least points scored of any player who played all 6 of their games. While Conrad was certainly a fan favorite, he was definitely a reach. Round 1, Pick 2, Chase Lucas. With their first pick, the Hillsborough Highlanders selected Chase Lucas, a technique-style player whose sub-archetype proved to be manipulator. Though it took a couple games for Lucas to find his style, find it he did, and he became better at utilizing tough-to-call top or side hits that are practically unhittable than perhaps any player in the entire league. It was an incredibly specialized strategy that didn't work more often than it did, but when it did, it was a practically guaranteed elimination. Lucas's best game came in Week 4 where he scored a good 17 points on 7 eliminations and 3 regicides, a great stat sheet for the game to be sure, and broke double-digit points in 4 of his 6 games, including 3 second-place finishes. Lucas finished close to the middle of the pack with a 22nd ranked points scored, averaging just under 12 points per game. He certainly wasn't a bad player, but as the second pick in the whole draft, we have to go with a reach. Round 1, Pick 3, Henry Waddell. Rose City selected Waddell with the 3rd overall pick, a technique player of the corner threat sub-archetype. Waddell's best game was his last, where he finished the season on a strong note, scoring a great 21 points with 8 eliminations and 3 regicides, in a game with Johnny Collier and Riley Graham no less. All his other games are at least average or even really good, and Waddell's accolades are no joke either. He finished tied for 6th in points per game with just under 19, as well as 10th for eliminations per game, regicides per game, and adjusted points per game, meaning he was top 10 in every per game stat in the league, as well as being named the second place team in the league with a 3rd place, 2nd place, and 1st place match victory across 3 games. However, there is one major problem with Waddell's stats. He only played 3 games. He missed half of the season, which severely hurts his total counting stats. Waddell, with around 19 points per game, scored only the 25th most points total. That is bottom 10 in the league. Had Waddell played all 6 games, he could have been a surefire top 10 player, but because he missed so much time, he really hurt his team's championship chances. Having your player actually play for you is probably the single most important thing a team can hope for a player coming out of the draft, and that's why, even though Waddell could very well be one of the best players in the entire league, we're going to count him as a reach. Round 1, Pick 4, Jared Istuk. The eventual league champions, the Cedar Mill Shockwave, picked up Jared Istuk with their first pick. Istuk's style was a technique player with the sub-archetype of manipulator class. Known around the league for his signature spin ball he would execute on practically every play. Jared's best game was in Week 2, Game 1, where he scored 21 points on 7 eliminations and 2 regicides, placing 2nd once and 3rd 3 times across his 6 games. Istuk was a top 10 ranked player for 3 weeks, but fell just barely outside to 13th after an off performance in his last game where he scored just 10 points, the least of any of his 6 games. Just like in total points, Istuk was barely outside the top 10 in pretty much every recorded stat, and considering he was the lowest ranked player on his team, that really tells you how stacked the Shockwave really were. While it may be a bit of a stretch considering he's the 4th overall pick, being a borderline top 10 player has convinced us to dub him a good pick. Round 1, Pick 5, Audrey Winkle. With the 5th overall pick, the Beaverton Ballers selected Audrey Winkle, a technique player who focused on a corner threat playstyle, always taking the game to the short side of the table when possible. Winkle's best game came in Week 5, Game 1, where she scored an amazing 19 points on 5 eliminations and 1 regicide, but aside from Week 4, Game 1, she never had another 15-plus point performance. Audrey finished 21st in total points scored, averaging just under 13 points per game, and her accolades don't speak to much except 2 third-place finishes. She was a solid role player, but as a first-rounder, we have no choice but to label Audrey Winkle as a reach. Round 1, Pick 6, Camille Jorgensen. With the last pick of the first round, the Aloha Gladiators selected Camille Jorgensen out of BYU. Jorgensen was a balanced archetype with a playstyle of all-rounder, with no defined true strength or weaknesses. Her best performance was in Week 3, Game 5, where she scored 12 points on 2 eliminations, enough to earn her only top 3 finish in any of her 6 games. Camille finished 26th in total points scored, averaging just over 9 points per game, and is one of 2 rostered players to have never recorded a regicide during the season. Like the previous pick, Camille was a consistent role player in her game, but as a player selected in the first round, we have to title her a reach. That'll do it for the first round, where we had 5 reaches, 1 good pick, and 0 steals thus far. Make sure to tune in for the second round retrospective, coming to you soon here on the PWL channel.